While America's middle class has been shrinking for decades, Australia's has remained remarkably stable and even grown. How is a country with similar roots and comparable challenges managing to do what the United States can't? I'm not talking about some far-off Scandinavian nation with completely different cultural DNA. Australia and America share British legal traditions, speak the same language, have similar immigration histories, and both are wealthy capitalist democracies. Yet when it comes to middle-class prosperity, they're diverging dramatically. In the next 9 minutes, you'll understand the specific policies, economic structures, and cultural choices that protect Australia's middle class, and what these differences reveal about income inequality in developed nations. We'll look at hard data, real people's experiences, and expert research to understand why one country's middle class thrives while another struggles. If you're interested in understanding the real economic forces shaping our world, hit subscribe. We're breaking down complex global trends in ways that actually make sense. Let's start with the numbers, because they tell a striking story. According to the OECD's definition, households earning between 60% and 200% of the median income, Australia's middle class comprises about 58% of the population. In America, that figure has dropped to 50%. But it's not just about the percentage. When you look at median wealth, the total assets minus debts of the typical household, the gap becomes startling. The Credit Suisse Global Wealth Report from 2023 found that Australian median wealth sits at approximately $273,000, while American median wealth is around $93,000. That's nearly 3 times higher in Australia. Income inequality measurements confirm this pattern. The Gini coefficient, which measures how evenly income is distributed in a society, where 0 means perfect equality and 1 means total inequality, shows Australia at 0.325 compared to America's 0.375. That might sound like a small difference, but in economic terms, it represents millions of people living fundamentally different financial realities. Let me give you a concrete example. Carlos is a construction worker in Sydney earning about $75,000 Australian dollars annually, roughly $75,000 US dollars with current exchange rates. That's a solidly middle-class income that allows him to own a modest home in outer suburbs, afford health care without worry, and contribute to retirement savings automatically. Now meet Miguel, who does essentially the same job in Phoenix, Arizona, also earning around $75,000. But Miguel struggles with medical debt from a health scare 3 years ago, can't afford a down payment in his city's housing market, and has minimal retirement savings because contributing to his 401k means cutting into his tight monthly budget. Same job, same income on paper, vastly different economic security. The gap isn't about work ethic, personal responsibility, or entrepreneurial spirit. Australians aren't inherently better savers or harder workers. It's about structural differences in how these nations distribute economic gains and protect people from financial catastrophe. But these numbers didn't happen by accident. To understand why Australia's middle class thrives, we need to look at 3 fundamental policy differences that emerged decades ago and continue shaping lives today. The first, and perhaps most consequential difference, is healthcare. In the United States, healthcare costs average about $12,500 per person annually when you include insurance premiums, out-of-pocket expenses, and government spending. In Australia, that figure is roughly $6,000. The World Health Organization's 2023 data shows Australia achieves better health outcomes while spending half as much per capita. But the real middle-class impact isn't about averages. It's about what happens when serious illness strikes. When Rachel, a marketing manager in Melbourne, was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 34, her treatment involved surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation over 9 months. Through Australia's Medicare system, her out-of-pocket costs totaled exactly $0. She took paid sick leave from work, received treatment at public hospitals, and had medication costs capped under the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. Her middle-class life, her savings, her home, her financial security remained intact. Compare that to Jessica, who works in a similar role in Seattle and received the same diagnosis at the same age. Despite having insurance through her employer, she faced $180,000 in medical costs. Insurance covered some, but high deductibles, co-pays, out-of-network charges, and services deemed not medically necessary left her with $75,000 in personal debt. She drained her savings, borrowed from family, and ultimately sold her condo to cover costs. A health crisis became a financial catastrophe. These aren't cherry-picked anecdotes. A Harvard University study published in 2019 found that 66% of bankruptcies in America are linked to medical issues, either because of costs or lost income during illness. In Australia, medical bankruptcy is virtually non-existent. Dr. Adam Elshog, a health economist at the University of Sydney, puts it this way: universal healthcare isn't just about treating illness. It's a middle-class wealth preservation system. When health emergencies can't destroy savings or force home sales, you protect the foundation of middle-class stability. The practical takeaway here is profound. Healthcare structure determines whether a medical crisis becomes a one-time challenge or a life-altering financial disaster. It's not about the quality of doctors or hospitals. American medical care is often excellent. It's about whether the system protects or punishes people for getting sick. Healthcare protects what you have, but Australia's next advantage helps you build wealth in the first place. Let's talk about wage structures and labor protections. Australia's national minimum wage is currently $23.23 per hour in US dollar equivalent. America's federal minimum wage remains $7.25, where it's been since 2009. Yes, many states and cities have higher minimums, but the federal floor means millions of workers earn wages that haven't kept pace with inflation for 15 years. This gap cascades upward. When the bottom is higher, wages throughout the income distribution rise. Here's what this looks like in practice. James works at a cafe in Brisbane, making $25 per hour. Australian law requires his employer to contribute an additional 11% to his superannuation retirement account. Money James never has to think about, but that's building his future wealth. He gets 4 weeks of paid annual leave, plus additional leave for sick days. When he works weekends, he earns penalty rates, 25% to 50% extra. He's not in a union, but his industry has minimum standards set by the Fair Work Commission that apply to all cafes nationwide. Now meet Devin, who works at a similar cafe in Portland, Oregon. He makes $15 per hour. Portland has a higher minimum than federal, but it's still substantially less. He has no retirement contributions from his employer. He gets no paid vacation. He can take time off, but it's unpaid, which he can rarely afford. Weekend shifts pay the same rate as weekday shifts. The cafe employs him at 28 hours per week to avoid classifying him as full-time, which would trigger benefit requirements. Both are hardworking people doing honest work. The difference is that James's labor has structural protections built into the economic system, while Devin's security depends entirely on his employer's choices and market forces. The Melbourne Institute's research tracking wage trends over 2 decades found that wage stagnation in Australia has been 40% less severe than in the United States when adjusted for inflation. That doesn't mean Australian workers aren't facing challenges. Wage growth has slowed there too, but strong wage floors create upward pressure across all income levels, preventing the phenomenon of the working poor that's become common in America. The takeaway? Labor market rules aren't neutral. They're choices about how economic gains get distributed. Strong minimum standards lift the floor, which changes the entire structure of middle-class possibility. But earning a decent wage is only part of the equation. What you can actually buy with that income matters just as much, which brings us to housing policy and generational wealth. Home ownership rates in Australia and America are actually quite similar, 67% and 66% respectively. But that similarity masks crucial differences in how people achieve ownership and what it means for building wealth. When Priya, a high school teacher in Brisbane, and her partner decided to buy their first home at age 31, they used several advantages built into Australian policy. They accessed the First Home Owners Grant, which provided $10,000 toward their purchase. They were able to use some of their superannuation savings for the down payment under specific conditions. Most importantly, they were competing primarily against other families trying to buy homes, not against large investment firms treating housing as a financial asset. Marcus teaches high school in Chicago, earns a comparable income to Priya when adjusted for cost of living, and has been trying to buy a home for 8 years. He's saved diligently, but home prices in accessible neighborhoods have risen faster than his savings. He's competing not just against other families, but against institutional investors, private equity firms, and real estate investment trusts that can pay cash and above asking price because they're turning homes into rental income streams. Now, let's be clear about complexity here. Australia absolutely has housing affordability problems, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, where median prices relative to income have reached concerning levels. Young Australians in these cities face serious challenges entering the market. But here's the key difference. Australian policy still structurally favors owner-occupiers over investors through tax treatment. Negative gearing, where investors can deduct rental losses from their income tax, exists but faces ongoing political debate and restrictions. In contrast, American tax policy and the rise of corporate landlords have turned housing into an asset class where families compete against institutional capital. The Australian Bureau of Statistics shows the median home price-to-income ratio in Sydney, Australia's most expensive city, is 7.1. In San Francisco, it's 8.9. But beyond the numbers, it's about who's buying. When housing policy prioritizes residents over investors, you preserve the traditional path to middle-class wealth accumulation, home ownership that builds equity over time. The practical takeaway is that housing isn't just about supply and demand. It's about whether policy treats homes primarily as places to live or as investment vehicles. That choice shapes who can access home ownership and whether it remains a wealth-building tool for the middle class. These structural advantages compound over time. But there's one more system that locks in middle-class stability in a way America simply doesn't have. It's called superannuation, and it's mandatory wealth building. Since 1992, Australia has required employers to contribute a percentage of every worker's wages into a retirement account, currently 11%, rising to 12% by 2025. This isn't optional. It's not contingent on employee choice or matching contributions. Every worker, from executives to baristas, has employers putting 11% of their wages into long-term savings they can't access until retirement. The results are dramatic. According to the Association of Superannuation Funds of Australia, the average Australian approaching retirement has approximately $250,000 in their superannuation account. In America, the median 401k balance across all age groups is around $87,000, and many workers have nothing at all because participation is optional. Let me introduce you to Nathan, an electrician in Perth. He's 58, approaching retirement, and has never thought of himself as particularly good with money or disciplined about saving. But after 30 years of working, with employers automatically contributing 11% of his wages the entire time, his superannuation balance sits at $340,000. That money was invested, grew through compound returns, and will fund a comfortable retirement. Robert is an electrician in Detroit, equally skilled and hardworking as Nathan. He's also 58 and has tried to contribute to his 401k when possible. But early in his career, money was tight and retirement seemed distant. During the 2008 financial crisis, he paused contributions to make ends meet. A few years of medical expenses for his daughter made saving impossible. His current 401k balance is $43,000. Same profession, similar income trajectory, vastly different retirement security. The difference isn't character or discipline, it's system design. Ross Clare, Director of Research at the Association of Superannuation Funds, explains it this way. Compulsory savings removes the discipline question. It treats retirement security as infrastructure, not individual virtue. When you make wealth accumulation automatic rather than optional, you create middle-class stability across all income levels, regardless of whether someone is naturally a saver. The Mercer CFA Institute Global Pension Index ranks Australia's retirement income system third globally in terms of adequacy, sustainability, and integrity. The United States ranks 22nd. That's not because Americans are less responsible. It's because one system makes wealth accumulation automatic while the other makes it optional, and optional consistently fails the middle class. The takeaway is profound. Financial security shouldn't depend on whether you're naturally disciplined about saving. Systems that automate wealth building create dramatically different outcomes for people living otherwise similar lives. So if Australia has found solutions that work, universal healthcare, strong wage floors, housing policy that favors residents, mandatory retirement savings, why hasn't America adopted similar approaches? This is where political economy and cultural differences come into play. Australia developed its social safety net through both Labor governments and Liberal, that's their Conservative Party, governments. There's been bipartisan consensus, more or less, that middle-class stability benefits everyone and isn't primarily an ideological question. When Paul Keating, a Labor Prime Minister, introduced compulsory superannuation in 1992, and when the Liberal Party expanded Medicare in the 1990s, these were framed as pragmatic economic policies, not partisan victories. American political culture has increasingly treated universal programs as ideological rather than pragmatic. Healthcare, minimum wage, retirement security. These become identity markers in culture war debates rather than policy questions to be analyzed for effectiveness. Here's a small but telling example. In 2019, when a community in Melbourne debated expanding Medicare coverage for certain dental procedures, local forums focused on cost-effectiveness data, health outcomes from similar programs, and budget implications. People disagreed, but the framework was pragmatic. In comparable community debates across American towns about healthcare expansion, discussions often deadlock along partisan lines before ever analyzing evidence or outcomes. The Australian National University's 2022 Social Value Survey found that 78% of Australians across the political spectrum support universal healthcare in principle. Pew Research found that 54% of Americans support a Medicare for all system, with sharp partisan divides. The question isn't whether universal healthcare works. Australia, Canada, the UK, Japan, and many others demonstrate it can, but whether American political culture can frame it as infrastructure rather than ideology. Now, let's acknowledge complexity. Australia isn't a utopia. Indigenous Australians face significant economic disparities that mirror America's racial wealth gaps. Recent political shifts show growing inequality concerns, wage stagnation in some sectors, and housing affordability creating generational divides. Australia has its own challenges and debates about how to maintain middle-class stability. But the takeaway remains important. Policy effectiveness depends partly on whether societies view economic security as collective infrastructure, like roads or public schools, or as individual responsibility where success and failure are personal moral outcomes. Australia leans more toward the infrastructure view. America leans more toward the individual responsibility view. Neither is absolutely right or wrong, but they produce measurably different results for middle-class prosperity. Understanding these differences reveals something important about how nations make choices. The shrinking of America's middle class isn't some inevitable force of globalization or technological change that no country can resist. Australia faces the same global pressures: automation, competition, changing industries, but structural choices buffer the impact on middle-class families. Let me synthesize what we've covered, because three key insights emerge from this comparison. First, Australia's middle-class strength isn't accidental or cultural. It results from specific, measurable policy choices about healthcare, wages, housing, and retirement. These policies were debated, legislated, and implemented through democratic processes. They could theoretically be adopted elsewhere, or could be changed if Australians chose differently. Second, these policies share a common philosophical thread. They treat economic security as social infrastructure rather than individual achievement. Healthcare isn't a reward for good employment. It's a universal system. Retirement savings aren't a test of personal discipline. They're mandatory. Minimum wages aren't charity. They're economic floors that lift the entire structure. This doesn't eliminate individual effort or reward. Australians still work hard, compete, and build careers, but it provides a foundation beneath market outcomes. Third, both countries face serious challenges. Australia grapples with housing affordability, particularly for young people in major cities. Wage growth has slowed. Cost of living pressures are real. America offers higher top-end earning potential, greater innovation in certain sectors, and geographic diversity that creates varied economic opportunities. Neither country has perfected middle-class prosperity, but structural protections in Australia buffer families from the worst impacts of economic turbulence in ways American families increasingly don't experience. Why does this matter? Because these aren't distant comparisons or theoretical exercises. These are policy experiments happening in real time, in countries similar enough to make meaningful comparisons, revealing different approaches to shared prosperity in advanced economies. When middle classes shrink, entire societies become less stable, less mobile, less innovative, and more divided. Understanding how some countries maintain middle-class stability while others struggle isn't about declaring winners and losers. It's about learning what works. The shrinking American middle class isn't inevitable. It's a result of choices about healthcare, labor policy, housing, retirement systems, and tax structures that can be examined, debated, and potentially changed. Australia's experience shows that middle-class stability in a modern capitalist democracy is possible, though not without trade-offs and ongoing challenges. Share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I'm especially interested in perspectives from people who've lived in both countries or have direct experience with these systems. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.